The body of 6-year-old child beauty queen JonBenét Ramsey was found in the basement of her family's home on the day after Christmas in 1996. The notorious crime has never been solved, but investigators have spent the last 3 decades delving further into the Ramsey family for possible leads. Their work has brought to light strange facts and connections that make the tragic case of JonBenét all the more mysterious. So, today we're uncovering some little-known facts about JonBenét Ramsey's family. Before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel. After that, leave a comment and let us know what other true crime topics you would like to hear about. Okay, time to reopen this cold case. JonBenét Ramsey was slain in her home in Boulder, Colorado, sometime between December 25th and December 26th, 1996. Apart from some inconclusive trace DNA and a bizarre ransom note, there was very little evidence for police to go on. So the Ramsey family themselves immediately drew the attention of both investigators and the media. JonBenét's immediate family included her father John Ramsey, her mother Patsy Ramsey, and her 9-year-old brother Burke Ramsey. Also in the picture was her older stepbrother John Andrew Ramsey, who was John's son from a previous marriage. And at one point or another, all of them were under suspicion. And rumors of a family member's potential involvement are swirling in the court of public opinion to this day. Four years prior to JonBenét's murder, her father John lost another young daughter, Elizabeth Pash Ramsey. Elizabeth was one of John's children from his first marriage to Lucinda Pash, and she worked as a flight attendant for Delta Airlines before she died at the age of 22 in a car accident in January 1992. By all accounts, it was simply a freak accident. Her boyfriend lost control of his car in a rainstorm, and their vehicle was hit by a truck. But after JonBenét's death, investigators pulled Elizabeth's autopsy report on the off chance there was any link to her death and JonBenét's. There wasn't, but because of the case's shocking nature and the lack of any official suspects, some speculation still exists. Nearly 20 years before JonBenét's murder, her mother Patsy Ramsey was crowned Miss West Virginia in a 1977 beauty pageant. Patsy grew up in the pageant circuit, and what was a way of life for her soon became fodder for criticism during the murder investigation of her daughter. Critics and investigators alike implied that JonBenét Ramsey never really wanted to do pageants, and that Patsy was just trying to live vicariously through her daughter, pressuring JonBenét and fostering a negatively competitive environment. There has been no evidence of this, or of anything that directly links Patsy to the crime, but the pageant mom characterization cast Patsy in a negative light and led to speculations of abuse. John Ramsey stated multiple times that beauty pageants in which JonBenét participated were just a way for her and Patsy to bond. But in retrospect, he admitted he wished they'd never entered their child in them. Allegedly, Patsy Ramsey saw the pageants as the center of JonBenét's young life. Although the media characterized JonBenét as a toddler beauty queen, and virtually every single public image of JonBenét is a pageant photo, she only ever participated in 9 pageants. In fact, many who knew JonBenét, including her parents, referred to her as a tomboy at heart. Investigators from The Independent would later draw attention to how involved the Ramseys were in their daughter's career and would rightfully question whether it is appropriate or even safe for young children to participate in beauty pageants. This was a viewpoint shared by many, and it continued to paint a sinister picture of the Ramseys in the public eye. JonBenét's older brother Burke, who was 9 years old at the time of her death, doesn't seem like an obvious suspect. However, he drew suspicion from investigators after they learned of some of his troubling behavior. For example, Burke had a scatological obsession and would smear his feces throughout the house. Crime scene evidence found his feces smeared on a box of candy he gave JonBenét for Christmas. The family housekeeper recalled Burke covering a bathroom wall with his excrement, and during the murder investigation, she recounted finding fecal matter the size of a grapefruit in JonBenét's bed, which she believed had been left there by Burke. According to a report in Vanity Fair, fingerprints found at the scene indicate that on the night of the murder, Burke made himself a snack of pineapple with milk and tea. Theoretically, JonBenét may have stolen a piece of the fruit because it was her favorite dessert, and that minor offense may have been the catalyst for the grisly events that followed. However, this is just speculation. John Andrew Ramsey was an older son from John Ramsey's first marriage, and he played an unexpected role in the murder investigation. Police found John Andrews' suitcase near the crime scene, which was strange because it was not where the Ramseys typically kept their luggage. Even more strange was the suitcase's contents, which included a blanket with John Andrews' semen on it. Given that JonBenét's body showed signs of assault, John Andrew was briefly considered a suspect, but he was ultimately cleared of having any involvement with the murder. But what about the suitcase's unusual location? Investigators later theorized that the suspect tried to put JonBenét's body in it, but for whatever reason decided to leave her behind. Absolutely everyone had a theory about who killed JonBenét, including her aunt, Pamela Paugh, who was the younger sister of Patsy Ramsey, as well as a fellow beauty queen. Paugh, for her part, felt certain the murderer was someone JonBenet knew and trusted since there was no sign of struggle in her room. That would seem to include her whole family. But Paugh, nonetheless, theorized the murderer must have been a family friend jealous over John Ramsey's wealth. And some passages from the ransom note seem to indicate that the killer may have been a co-worker of John Ramsey's, although the authenticity of the note has never been established. In fact, several people involved with the case, including investigators and prosecutors, believe the note was actually written by Patsy in an attempt to cover up the crime. Patsy Ramsey never fully escaped the suspicion that followed her after her daughter's murder, but she did do her best to start fresh in the subsequent years. For instance, she was diagnosed with ovarian cancer in 1993, just a few years before JonBenét's death. After chemotherapy, Patsy's cancer went into remission, and she lived a healthy life for nearly a decade until it came back in the early 2000s. When the Ramseys moved to Georgia following the crime, Patsy became deeply involved with the local community and regularly corresponded with cancer patients, even while her own cancer was in remission. And when that cancer returned, Patsy still reportedly tried to lift the spirits of fellow patients. John and Patsy eventually moved to Charlevoix, Michigan, a place they vacationed before and after JonBenét's murder. Patsy again became an active member of the community there until her cancer returned a final time, and she passed away in 2006. In a 2012 interview, John Ramsey told CBS that he felt Patsy wasn't an overbearing mother and that the media's poor portrayal of her had been an unfair angle. He said, "Patsy had just come out of cancer treatments. I think deep down she didn't know how long she had to live and how much time she had to spend with her child, so she tried to pack a lot into a day." Unlike his parents, Burke Ramsey managed to stay out of the public eye during much of the murder investigation and its aftermath. In 2016, he made some public appearances where he admitted to purposely trying to stay out of the spotlight. As of 2018, Burke was a software engineer who reportedly worked from home. Burke may have liked to put feces in his sister's bed, but it seems he did love her, or at least he says he did. In a 2016 interview commemorating the 20th anniversary of JonBenét's murder, he even claimed that he continued to talk to his sister for years after her death. Burke also said he believed Patsy and JonBenet were reunited in heaven and that both were watching over him. He even noted that when he was in school, he occasionally asked JonBenet for help on tests and often wished the two of them could be together. Burke's incredibly private life may account for his odd behavior in rare interviews. After a 2016 interview with Dr. Phil McGraw, for example, McGraw had to assure the media that Burke was extremely nervous on camera, which is why he kept smiling when talking about his sister's murder. In December of 2016, Burke Ramsey filed a $750 million lawsuit against CBS over statements made in the documentary The Case of JonBenet Ramsey. Burke felt the documentary falsely led viewers to believe he accidentally killed his sister. He was so angry about it, he even filed another $150 million suit against one of the pathologists who appeared in the documentary, stating his adamant belief that Burke was JonBenet's killer. CBS, for their part, argued that cold case shows often point the finger at different people, which they maintained is not the same as formally accusing someone of murder. However, the network's motion to dismiss was denied in 2018, and the suit was later settled to the satisfaction of all parties. In 2005, 18-year-old Natalie Holloway made headlines when she disappeared during a trip to Aruba. A few years after Holloway's disappearance, and shortly after Patsy Ramsey's death, Natalie's mother, Beth Holloway Twitty, met John Ramsey through mutual friends. Throughout the following year, Twitty and Ramsey were seen multiple times together, and according to a 2007 report in People magazine, the two have been seen holding hands and kissing in her hometown, as well as attending art shows and eating in restaurants together. The relationship was short-lived, but made for a sensationalized connection in the true crime tabloids. In fairness to the couple, they shared a tragedy that can't be understood by most people. However, unlike John, Beth would eventually get some closure in 2023 when Joran Vandersloot confessed to taking her daughter's life. While his relationship with Beth Holloway Twitty came to an end, John Ramsey tied the knot for a third time in 2011, marrying Jan Rousseau, a designer from Las Vegas, in a private ceremony in Charlevoix, Michigan. Charlevoix was the same town where John and Patsy lived in the years preceding Patsy's death. When People magazine asked John what JonBenét would think of this new marriage, he simply replied, "I have no doubt she will be smiling."
Long before The Bachelor, there was The Dating Game, a television game show where a woman would question male contestants hidden from her view to find the man of her dreams, or as the case may be, the serial killer of her nightmares. It sounds like a Saturday Night Live sketch, but this terrifying scenario actually played out in real life. Time to get singled out. Rodney Alcala was born August 23, 1943, in San Antonio, Texas, and grew up in Los Angeles as a gifted student with an otherwise unremarkable youth. At 17, he joined the Army, and it was during his service that his dark side first entered the record. Alcala's commanding officer found him insubordinate, manipulative, and vindictive, and his file showed he was disciplined on several occasions for physically attacking women. In 1964, he went AWOL in the midst of a nervous breakdown and was eventually diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. He would subsequently leave the Army and managed to graduate from the UCLA School of Fine Arts. But in September of 1968, Alcala was seen luring 8-year-old Tali Shapiro into his Hollywood apartment. By the time police arrived, he had used a steel bar to beat her into a coma that would last over a month. The police managed to save Tali Shapiro, but Alcala had fled both the scene and the state. He would head all the way across the country to New York City, where he would enroll at NYU Film School under the alias of John Berger. Ironically, while he was there, Alcala would take a class taught by Roman Polanski, the famed director who would himself flee the country 10 years later to avoid being charged with sex crimes. What are the odds? In 1971, Alcala got a job at the Blue Cross Blue Shield Association, where he worked alongside a guy named Richard Cottingham, soon to be better known to the public as the Torso Killer or the Times Square Ripper. Cottingham would eventually be convicted of 18 murders and claim responsibility for over 60 more. There's no evidence they knew of each other's crimes, or were even friends, but Blue Cross presumably changed their hiring policies after that. 1971 would also be the year of Alcala's first known murder, which occurred on June 12th, when he strangled 23-year-old TWA flight attendant Cornelia Crilly at her Manhattan apartment. Unfortunately, Alcala wouldn't be connected with the crime until 2011, a full 40 years later. But his brutal attack on 8-year-old Tali Shapiro got him added to the FBI's most wanted list, which would plaster his face on wanted posters at the post office and get him recognized by 2 children. He was arrested and extradited back to California to stand trial for his attack on Tali Shapiro. But Tali's mother wouldn't allow her to testify, so Alcala could only be convicted of the lesser charge of child. He was sentenced to 3 years in jail, but only served 17 months before being released. Seems like maybe they should have kept him longer. Less than 8 weeks later, Alcala was arrested for assaulting a 13-year-old girl. Despite his status as a dangerous repeat offender, he was back on the street by 1976, just 2 short years later. Given how easy the California penal system seemed to be taking it on Alcala, it's not surprising that his parole officer inexplicably decided it would be cool for him to up and move to New York. After all, what harm could he do there? Well, since you asked, according to the NYPD, a week after Alcala returned to the Big Apple, he allegedly slew 23-year-old Ellen Jane Hover, who just happened to be the goddaughter of Rat Pack legends Dean Martin and Sammy Davis Jr. Under interrogation, Alcala admitted to knowing her, and additional evidence tied him to her disappearance. But his culpability in her murder was never conclusively proven. Not surprisingly, Alcala did not stick around in New York for long. He headed back to Los Angeles in '78, and worked a series of jobs, including a brief stint as a typesetter at the Los Angeles Times. Around this point, Alcala would also be questioned in the Hillside Strangler killings due to his status as a sex offender. While he absolutely seems like a prime suspect, the police ruled out Alcala as the strangler, and the culprit eventually turned out to be two men working together. But Alcala wasn't exactly staying out of trouble either. He started fraudulently holding himself out as a professional fashion photographer, a title he used to trick hundreds of men and women, including several minors, into posing nude for him. He then shared those pictures with his co-workers, and when questioned about the images of minors, Alcala insisted the model's parents had hired him to take the photos, which is a bad excuse. All that means is more people need to go to jail than just you, Rodney. Many of the people in his photograph collection remain unidentified to this day. Investigators believe at least some of them were likely among his victims. It was after all of that, in September of 1978, that Rodney Alcala was selected to appear in the all-new Dating Game. For everyone who didn't grow up in the 70s, the Dating Game was a game show hosted by Jim Lang. Contestants were single folks, usually women, who would ask getting-to-know-you questions of three other contestants of the opposite sex. Like everything else on the show, the questions and answers were typically laced with racy innuendos. The Bachelorette could hear but not see the bachelors. And at the end of the show, she'd pick one of them and go on a date with him. In the episode in which he appeared, the contestant was Cheryl Bradshaw, and Alcala was Bachelor number 1, introduced as a successful photographer who got a start when his father found him in the darkroom at the age of 13, fully developed. It was also noted that, between takes, you might find him skydiving or motorcycling. The description neglected to mention that by that point, Alcala was an active serial killer, having already taken the lives of 18-year-old Jill Terry Barkham and 27-year-old Georgia Marie Wixted, and possibly others. But since no one seemed to be aware of that, Bradshaw cheerfully asked Alcala to describe what kind of meal he would be, to which he answered, "I'm called the Banana, and I look really good. Peel me." Bradshaw found it funny, and in what could have easily become the worst decision she ever made in her life, she chose Alcala to be her date. Yeah, not only was a serial killer a contestant on the Dating Game, but he actually won. I wonder how the guys who lost to Alcala felt. One of those other contestants talked to Alcala and would later describe him as a standout creepy guy in my life. And he wasn't the only one who thought so. Despite the fact she picked him to be the winner, Bradshaw immediately changed her mind after meeting Alcala face to face. Because she thought he was acting really creepy, they did not end up going on that date. After snatching defeat from the jaws of victory on the Dating Game, Alcala went on a rampage that would become notorious, racking up victims at a drastically increased rate. In June of '78, he slew 31-year-old legal secretary Charlotte Lee Lamb. And in February of '79, he kidnapped 15-year-old hitchhiker Monique Hoyt. Hoyt managed to escape and report the crime to police, but Alcala's mother was allowed to bail him out of jail. The following June, Alcala dispatched 21-year-old Jill Marie Parenteau after meeting her at a local bar several times. He did the same to 12-year-old Robin Christine Samso that same month, whom he abducted while she was returning home from her ballet class. Some have theorized that Alcala's rejection on the Dating Game may have exacerbated his bloodlust. Rodney Alcala was finally apprehended in June of 1979 and convicted the following year. But the verdict against Alcala would ultimately be overturned by the California Supreme Court, who believed jurors had been improperly informed of his former crimes. He was convicted after a retrial in May of 1986, but that conviction was overturned in federal court. Prosecutors were starting prep for round 3 when they made a chilling discovery. Alcala's DNA, which had been collected during his imprisonment, connected him to the murders of 4 other women, Barkham, Wixted, Lamb, and Parenteau. After some legal wrangling over whether the cases should be tried individually or together, Alcala finally went on trial for all 5 slayings in February of 2010. Despite the old saying that a man who represents himself has a fool for a client, Alcala decided to represent himself. It went exactly the way you think. During the trial, Alcala took the stand in his own defense. role-playing two different parts as if they were separate people, the interrogator and the witness. When playing the former, he would ask himself questions in a comically deep voice while addressing himself as Mr. Alcala. He also made the jury watch clips of his appearance on The Dating Game and listen to Arlo Guthrie's classic anti-war novelty song Alice's Restaurant. But ultimately, Alcala barely presented a defense. He merely claimed he didn't remember harming any of the women, and insisted he was applying for a job as a photographer at Knott's Berry Farm at the time of one of the crimes being committed. Alcala was convicted for a third time, but not for the final time. He was finally indicted for the slayings of Cornelia Crilly and Ellen Jane Hover in 2011. After initially denying the charges, he pleaded guilty so he could return to California and continue appealing the death sentence he'd received for his previous conviction. The Dating Game's worst contestant ever finally passed away in 2021 in a California prison at the age of 77.
In the 1990s, a teacher took advantage of her position and set into motion one of the most bizarre scandals that dominated headlines and shook the country to its core. Decades later, the story would partially inspire the 2023 film May December, meaning the Notorious case still hasn't totally faded from memory. All right, students, open your textbooks to page Weird. Classrooms have likely always buzzed with rumors of improper relationships between teachers and students. But it's also likely school administrators quietly dimmed any case that came to light with resignations and tight-lipped excuses. If it seems like reported misconduct and convictions occur more frequently these days, the reason may involve one of the most bizarre and upsetting scandals of the 1990s. Mary Kay Letourneau was a school teacher in Burien, Washington, when 12-year-old Vili Falau entered her Shorewood Elementary 6th grade class in 1996. The artistic student reportedly suffered an abusive home life and soon became close with Letourneau and her husband Steve, accompanying them and their 4 children on trips. In June 1997, Letourneau and Falau began a relationship and produced 2 daughters, capturing the public's attention and leading to jail time for the 34-year-old teacher. 24-hour news stations and talk show hosts could not get enough of the story. For her part, Letourneau genuinely believed she found love with the child and defied all common sense and court orders to stay with him. Does the story make any more sense if we move backward in time? Let's investigate. In 1982, Mary Catherine Schmitz left Washington to attend Arizona State University. Her future husband, Steve Letourneau, was a football player at the college, and the two began dating. In 1984, a pregnant Mary Kay married Steve, and the two returned to Washington, where she earned a teaching degree from Seattle University. She took a job with Shorewood Elementary in 1989. Vili Falau became Mary Kay's student in 1991 when she taught 2nd grade. By the time he was her student again in 1996, Mary Kay and her husband Steve had 4 children together. Some sources thought the Letourneau marriage appeared doomed from the start, as it involved wedlock due to an unexpected pregnancy. Allegedly, there was also unaddressed infidelity on Steve's part, the couple's troubles staying afloat financially, and Mary Kay's emotional problems. She cared for her children while studying for her teaching license at night, possibly setting the stage for the scandal to come. Vili Falau came from an abusive household where his mother Suna physically attacked him and her other 3 children, while she herself was often physically attacked by her husband, Lueva. Child Protective Services was a frequent visitor to the Falau home, but nothing came of the investigations. When Mary Kay Letourneau and Falau met again in her 6th grade class in 1996, she was 34 years old and he was 12. The troubled Falau used art as a way to escape from his alleged maltreatment at home. Letourneau began working with him to improve his artistic ability that year. She also invited him to spend time with her family. He reportedly grew close to her eldest son, Steve Jr. In addition, she purchased art supplies for the preteen, took him along on a family vacation to Alaska, and pushed him to excel in different areas of his life. After Letourneau suffered worsening marital troubles and a miscarriage in 1996, sources say Mary Kay Letourneau's mental state took a sharp decline. It was under these circumstances that Letourneau began her relationship with 12-year-old Vili Falau, a decision that would inextricably link the young boy to her for the rest of their lives. Folau admitted the two frequently engaged in and around August 1996, Letourneau and Folau conceived a child together. In February 1997, 8 months after the start of their relationship, and 6 months into Mary Kay Letourneau's pregnancy with Billy Folau's child, Letourneau's husband Steve discovered love letters between the two. One of Steve's relatives, aware of the correspondence, reported the affair to the Shorewood Elementary School District in March 1997. Law enforcement arrested Letourneau and charged her with coerced sex with a minor. 2 months later, she gave birth to the couple's first daughter, Audrey. Folau's mother, Suna, took custody of the baby, while Letourneau faced prison time. In August 1997, Judge Linda Lau allowed Mary Kay Letourneau to plead guilty to the charges of forced sex with a minor in exchange for suspending her sentence from 7.5 years to 3 months in prison. As part of this deal, Letourneau entered the sex offender registry. Also, meetings between Billy Folau and Letourneau became illegal, with a no-contact order in place. However, after Letourneau's prison release in January 1998, the couple lost no time in meeting up. In February of the same year, the couple conceived their second child, Georgia, born in October 1998, and police found them together in Letourneau's car. Judge Lau revoked the lessened sentence deal and sent Letourneau back to prison to complete her entire 7.5 years. So, yeah, maybe should have kept her in jail for a little while longer. While Mary Kay Letourneau served prison time, Billy Folau lived with his mother and 2 daughters. At the time of his eldest daughter Audrey's birth, Folau was 14 years old. Georgia arrived a year later, with Letourneau in prison and the teenagers struggling with fatherhood, adulthood, and adolescence. Consequently, Folau claimed the people around him convinced him to sue the school and say he no longer loved or wanted a relationship with the mother of his children. In 2002, Folau stated under oath he lost feelings for her and blamed the school system for the illegal relationship. He and his mother sued the Highline School District, but jurors found the district could not be held liable, and Folau was not awarded any damages. In August 2004, 2 years after Billy Folau claimed he no longer loved Mary Kay Letourneau, Letourneau left prison. The two wasted no time in reconnecting. The first order of business involved Folau requesting the voiding of the no-contact order between himself and Letourneau. Once the request was successful, the two planned a May 2005 wedding at a winery in Woodinville, Washington. Folau was now of age, and more than 200 guests attended the nuptials. Let's hope no one brought up how they met in any speeches. To make things even weirder, many companies and local establishments chose to turn this cycle of abuse and tragedy into a laughing matter. Fuel Sports Eats and Beats in Seattle held a Hot for Teacher Night in May 2009, boasting appearances by Mary Kay Letourneau and Billy Folau. Letourneau hosted the evening's festivities while her husband performed as DJ Curious. Patrons paid the cover fee in exchange for speaking to, taking photos with, and purchasing merchandise from the infamous couple, all while listening to upbeat music and drinking. I wonder how much that merch goes for on eBay. After his and Mary Kay's divorce was finalized in 1999, Steve Letourneau took the couple's 4 children to Alaska. He obtained full custody of the children and kept them from their mother during her time in prison. After their mother's 2004 release, Steve Jr., Mary Claire, Nicholas, and Jacqueline decided to spend time with their previously absent mother and new stepfather, who was only a few years their senior. Mary Claire took part in her mother's 2005 wedding, acting as maid of honor, while her half-sisters Audrey and Georgia were flower girls. In addition, Steve Jr. moved in with Mary Kay Letourneau and Billy Folau when he returned to Washington from Alaska in October 2005. Mary Claire chose the Art Institute of Seattle for schooling and was frequently in the unconventional family orbit. After 12 years of marriage, Billy Folau filed for legal separation from Mary Kay Letourneau in May 2017. In response, his wife filed a motion to dismiss the separation. After the filing, the couple continued to live in the same house, appeared together in public, and actively participated in a 2-hour A&E special entitled Mary Kay Letourneau Autobiography, which aired on May 29, 2018. Letourneau and Folau's separation became official in the summer of 2019. Alleged insiders cited Folau's concentration on becoming a full-time DJ and Letourneau's annoyance at doing most of the housework as possible reasons for the split. During the autobiography interview, Folau refused to speak about the legal filing. and Letourneau stated they were avoiding the topic. Rumors, based on an alleged Radar Online interview with Falau, claimed the split was a necessity for his involvement in a cannabis-related business, Cigaweed. Falau eventually released a statement through his lawyer in June 2017 denying the split related to any businesses. The statement did not share the actual reason for the filing, although the decades-wide age gap between the two and the fact that the relationship was founded on abuse might have had something to do with it. The story of this highly unconventional family unit is one founded on abuse, the failings of the educational system, and how our own desires can work against our best interests. It's a story that captured the imagination of the entire country and resurfaces repeatedly in new specials and film adaptations, including the Todd Haynes film May December, which stars Julianne Moore as a character inspired by Mary Kay Letourneau, and Charles Melton as the adult version of the young boy she seduces. The relationship in that movie doesn't work out much better.
Few things are more tragic than a missing persons report remaining unsolved. Families can be left with questions that may not be answered for years, decades, or ever. Such was the case in 1980 when the remains of a John and Jane Doe were discovered in the woods in Harris County, Texas. For over 40 years, the identities of the bodies remained a mystery. DNA evidence recently solved one mystery, only to open up several new ones, some of which remain unsolved to this day. All right, search parties, let's get searching. In 1978, talented cabinet maker Harold Dean Klaus Jr. met Tina Gale Lynn through their older siblings, who were already dating each other, which is a classic younger sibling move. The young pair started a romance of their own after discovering many shared interests, eventually marrying in June 1979 in New Smyrna Beach, Florida. Then the couple was excited to discover they were pregnant and expecting a child in the new year. Baby Holly was born in January of 1980 and was promptly doted on by her loving parents, aunts, uncles, and grandparents. However, shortly thereafter, Dean landed a job building homes during the early 80s construction boom and packed his wife, young daughter, and all their belongings into his 1978 two-door red burgundy AMC Concorde to make the trek to Dallas-Fort Worth, Texas, and start their new life. Unfortunately, the Lone Star State had a different, deadly fate in mind for them. Dean and Tina, who would have a celebrity name like Dina or Teen, moved in with Dean's cousin in Louisville for the first stint of their Texas life before eventually getting their own place. Letters home to family in Florida were steady throughout the last quarter of 1980, with the Klauses filling their loved ones in on their Texas adventures, job opportunities, and, of course, updates and photos of baby Holly. Nowadays, cell phones and social media make it relatively easy to stay in touch with loved ones, but back then it was either snail mail or a landline, and you can't send photos through a 1980s phone. According to Tina's sister, they were only in their new digs for 2, maybe 3 weeks before they seemed to vanish. Tina had sent out a letter just before Christmas 1980, which wound up being the last letter ever sent from the Klaus family. After that, all 3 members of the Klaus family unceremoniously disappeared. While the circumstances of the young family's disappearance were a mystery, it wasn't necessarily unexpected, thanks to the religious beliefs sometimes demonstrated by Dean Klaus and the religious group the Christ Family. When he was a young adult, Dean could often be found hanging out with white robe-clad individuals his family would derisively refer to as Jesus freaks. These individuals, the bluntly named Christ Family, were a group founded by Charles Franklin McHugh, who went by the blunt nickname Lightning Amen. Lightning Amen and his flock believed in nonviolence, detested materialism, and practiced sexual abstinence. In a time of more extreme fringe groups grabbing headlines like Jim Jones's People's Temple, which had collapsed into murder and mass suicide 2 years earlier, the Christ Family seemed comparatively mild. Dean and Tina are believed to have joined the group shortly after arriving in Texas, and went as far as following them to their camp about 40 miles from Yuma, Arizona. It is unknown how the family arrived in Arizona or why they left and returned to Texas, but it is believed that at some point they diverged from the Christ family group. Both Dean and Tina's families attempted to report them missing, but that's where the story gets even stranger. Due to the belief that the family joined a religious cult, the police theorized that Dean, Tina, and baby Holly were just living their lives as nomads, drifting from place to place, and didn't take the report seriously. This was seemingly confirmed when, a few weeks after the Klaus letters stopped arriving home in Florida, a mysterious woman reached out to the Klauses about buying Dean's AMC Concorde back. According to the caller, referred to only as Sister Susan, Dean and Tina had joined the Christ family group and were giving up all their worldly possessions and cutting ties to their families. She insisted that everything was absolutely fine and that no follow-ups would be needed or in fact tolerated. For obvious reasons, this explanation aroused some suspicion. Weeks after this bizarre incident, a man on a walk in the woods of Harris County, Texas, was shocked when his German Shepherd emerged from the thick of the forest with a decomposing arm in its mouth. The sheriff's department was called to the scene, where the bodies of an unidentified man and woman were found, with the skeletal remains showing signs of foul play. The bodies, known only then as the Harris County Jane and John Doe, would go unidentified for 40 years. Due to little evidence being left at the scene, the bodies of John and Jane Doe were buried in anonymous graves and became another part of the unsolved case backlog. Then in 2011, the bodies were exhumed to extract DNA, which would eventually open the door to discovering who these does were and what they were doing the day they both died. For 10 years, that genetic information sat in a database until forensic genealogist Misty Gillis found a hit on a missing persons case. With the help of forensic genetic genealogist Allison Peacock, a team of scientists was able to not only positively ID Dean and Tina Klaus, but also find their next of kin over the next few months. Once they tracked down the family, they explained what they knew. Dean and Tina had been slain sometime between October and December of 1980, with Dean bound, gagged, and bludgeoned, and Tina strangled. While the details were heartbreaking and tragic, the family finally had some closure. Except, once the gruesome details were sorted out, Dean Klaus's sister raised a very important question. What happened to baby Holly? The identification of the Klauses kicked off an investigation as to what may have happened to baby Holly. Baby Holly would have been just a shade under 1 year old when her parents were slain, but her whereabouts were not found anywhere near the crime scene. Eventually, the investigation led to a Seventh-day Adventist church in Yuma, Arizona, and its pastor, Philip McGoldrick. According to McGoldrick, one day in November 1980, 3 women clad in white robes approached his church with a baby girl and told him that due to their church's nomadic lifestyle, they couldn't raise the child. The trio, one of whom McGoldrick believed could have been Tina, handed the baby to the pastor alongside a paper relinquishing all rights, and were never seen again. McGoldrick, borrowing a decision from the story of baby Moses floating down the River Nile, decided to raise the baby as his own in the church. He eventually disclosed that she was not his biological child, but that he had no idea what had become of Holly's birth parents. Neither of them had any way of knowing the grim circumstances behind her adoption. In an ironic but happy twist of fate, young Holly ended up living her life with a loving family, completely oblivious to the fact that there was a nationwide search for her whereabouts. By 2022, the Texas Attorney General's Cold Case and Missing Persons Unit were actively trying to figure out what happened to the Klaus's baby girl. I mean, she was under 1. It's not like she could have walked very far. Finally, the aforementioned adoption certificate for baby Holly was the last piece of the puzzle investigators needed to finally uncover where she had been all this time. After a court order securing the certificate from Florida, this adoption certificate put investigators in contact with Philip McGoldrick, his wife Constance, and eventually his adopted daughter Holly. McGoldrick and Holly were living in Oklahoma at the time, so a reunion over Zoom was set up, and Holly got to meet her biological family for the first time in 40 years. Holly became close with Dean's mother Donna and feels blessed not only that she was spared the same fate as her birth parents, but that she was able to reunite with the rest of her family after so many years. Plus, a 40-year backlog of birthday presents from your grandparents ain't too shabby either. It's the least they could do. Unfortunately, whoever was behind the tragic fates of Dean and Tina is still unknown, and presumably still walks free, although the likelihood of that dwindles with each passing year. While Philip McGoldrick was briefly considered a suspect, he was cleared of any wrongdoing and just happened to be in the right place at the right time when Holly was given up for adoption. Sergeant Rachel Kading, an investigator with the Texas Attorney General's Cold Case and Missing Persons Unit, had also interviewed somewhere around 50 current and former members of the Christ Family religious group in the hopes of finding some information about what happened to Dean and Tina. But so far, their involvement with the group seems to be unrelated, and Kading feels confident that no evidence points to the church being involved in the couple's deaths. The prevailing theory is that the Klauses were hitchhiking and accepted a ride from the wrong person. The case seems to have run cold after 40 years. However, until very recently, it seemed impossible that baby Holly would ever turn up again. So even though this bizarre case may be cold, it's far from closed.
For an inquisitive adult with a diverse palate, choosing a favorite cuisine, let alone a single favorite dish, can prove a significant challenge. Picking the very last dish you will ever eat in your life is even more challenging. Do you go all out on Big Macs? Or something more refined? Or both? All right, dead man eating. In September of 1995, Dennis Wayne Bagwell and his girlfriend, Victoria Wolford, went to his mom's house in Wilson County, Texas, hoping to borrow money. While Wolford relaxed in a small travel trailer on the property, Bagwell went inside, and whatever happened next turned into a rampage. Bagwell was convicted of slaying 4 people, including his mother and a young child, and was later convicted of a 5th unrelated murder that took place at a bar where he worked. Nonetheless, he maintained his innocence throughout the remainder of his life, telling reporters, "They're fixin' to execute an innocent man," the day before his sentence was carried out in 2005. For his final meal, Bagwell consumed an enormous feast, including steak, fried chicken, barbecued ribs, a dozen scrambled eggs with onions, fried potatoes with onions, onion rings, bacon, sliced tomatoes, 2 hamburgers piled high with toppings, and a salad with ranch dressing. There was also peach pie for dessert, along with milk, coffee, and iced tea with sugar to drink. Yeah, it's not like he was counting calories at that point. In 2011, drifter and drug dealer Stephen Michael Woods Jr. was put to death by the state of Texas for the twin slayings of 21-year-old Ronald Whitehead and 19-year-old Bethina Braz. The duo were found near a golf course in Denton County in 2001. Woods maintained his innocence for the remainder of his life. Though he acknowledged that he'd been present when Whitehead and Braz were attacked, he insisted that it was actually his friend Marcus Rhodes who was responsible for their deaths. For his final meal, Jones made an elaborate stomach-busting combination of requests. This included strips of bacon, a large pizza topped with more bacon, plus sausage, pepperoni, and hamburger, individual burgers topped with yet more bacon, fried chicken breasts, a chicken fried steak, garlic breadsticks, and ice cream. To wash it all down, he requested Mountain Dew, Pepsi, root beer, and sweet tea, and presumably some Tums. If your parents rigorously checked your Halloween candy for razor blades every year, you have Ronald Clark O'Brien to blame. On Halloween in 1974, he poisoned his 8-year-old son Timothy with a tube of pixie sticks that he tainted with potassium cyanide. In an attempt to cover up the crime, O'Brien also gave the poisoned candy to his daughter and 3 other children. But fortunately, they didn't eat any of it. O'Brien was hoping to claim some life insurance money to help him settle more than $100,000 in outstanding debts, and he tried to spin a tale that the kids had received the tainted candy from a random neighbor while they were out trick-or-treating. Once police discovered his significant debts and the fact he'd taken out life insurance policies on his young children, they'd settled on a prime suspect. When chemist acquaintances of O'Brien confirmed he'd asked them specifically about how to obtain cyanide and how much might be fatal for a human, his twisted scheme became difficult to deny. In 1975, a jury took just 46 minutes to find O'Brien guilty, and his sentence was carried out via lethal injection in 1984. For his final meal, O'Brien requested no Halloween candy whatsoever. Instead, he opted for a medium to well-done T-bone steak, fries with ketchup, whole kernel corn, sweet peas, a salad with lettuce, tomato, egg, and French dressing, saltines, rolls, a Boston cream pie, and iced tea to drink. Iced tea is a strangely popular choice. The capital sentencing of Thomas J. Grasso in 1995 was a joint effort by the state of Oklahoma and New York. On Christmas Eve 1990, Grasso slew 87-year-old Hilda Johnson in Tulsa during a robbery. Then, in July 1991, he killed Leslie Holtz, his 81-year-old neighbor, in a New York boarding house. Grasso was convicted and sentenced to life in prison by the state of New York, then shipped off to Oklahoma, where he pleaded guilty to murder and was sentenced to death. This set off a legal tug-of-war between the two states, with New York keeping Grasso imprisoned and Oklahoma waiting in the wings to off him. The case became a hot-button issue during New York's 1994 gubernatorial race, with candidate George Pataki making Grasso's fate one of his main campaign pledges. Pataki won the race, and just 11 days after he took office, Grasso was shipped off to Oklahoma to sit on death row. For his final meal, Grasso had 24 steamed mussels, 24 steamed clams, a double cheeseburger from Burger King, a half-dozen barbecue spare ribs, 2 strawberry milkshakes, and a half pumpkin pie, with whipped cream and diced strawberries on top. Why not just ask for the whole pie? But one final item proved controversial. Grasso was given a 16-ounce can of spaghetti and meatballs, which were served at room temperature. Yet in his final statement to reporters just hours before the end of his life, the condemned man said, "I did not get my SpaghettiOs. I got spaghetti. I want the press to know this." In 1981, Marion Elbert Pruitt took 5 lives over a single year on a rampage across 4 states, including his common-law wife and 3 convenience store clerks. Pruitt committed all of these crimes while using the alias Charles Sonny Pearson, because he'd been in the federal witness protection program since 1979. At his trial, Pruitt described himself as a mad dog and partially blamed his loss of control on a $4,000 a week cocaine habit. Pruitt initially requested a roast duck for his final meal, but the prison lacked the facilities to prepare such an elaborate dish and rejected his choice. As a backup, he settled on a combo plate of fried eggplant, fried squash, and fried okra, along with some fast food favorites: 4 Burger King Whoppers with fries, and a stuffed crust pizza from Pizza Hut. The food was served alongside 3 2-liter bottles of Pepsi, and the whole meal concluded with an entire pecan pie. Thomas Grasso could have learned a thing or two there. In 1984, attorney George Crooks went over to the apartment of Robert Dale Conklin, a man he had been casually dating. But that night, things took a violent turn. When a maintenance man was searching the apartment complex's dumpsters 2 days later, he found scattered human remains that had been stuffed into black plastic garbage bags. A thorough search of the dumpster by authorities also revealed knives, bloody clothes and bedding, screwdrivers, rope, and a wallet, credit cards, and other personal materials belonging to George Crooks. Police also found a book in Conklin's bedroom that discussed the methodology for cutting up and disposing of a body, in case their suspicions weren't yet fully raised. Conklin went more haute cuisine with his final meal request than most of the inmates on our list. He asked for filet mignon wrapped in bacon, shrimp sautéed in garlic butter with lemon, a baked potato with all the fixins, corn on the cob, asparagus with hollandaise sauce, French bread with butter, goat cheese, cantaloupe, apple pie with vanilla bean ice cream, and, of course, iced tea to drink. Ronnie Lee Gardner was arrested for fatally shooting 37-year-old bartender Melvin John Otterstrom during a robbery in Salt Lake City, Utah. But his crime spree didn't end there. While being transferred to a court hearing, he made an escape attempt, during which he fatally shot 36-year-old attorney Michael Burdell with a pistol he had smuggled inside. Gardner was convicted of both murders. He was sentenced to life in prison for killing Otterstrom, but received the death penalty for Burdell's slaying. When his sentence was carried out in 2010, Gardner was the first American to be executed by a firing squad in 14 years. The family of the deceased Michael Burdell actually filed a legal appeal on Gardner's behalf, as Burdell was a pacifist who opposed the death penalty. Nonetheless, the state moved forward with their plans. Gardner enjoyed a comparatively modest final meal 48 hours before his execution, having steak, lobster tail, apple pie, vanilla ice cream, and 7-Up. It was what he did next that was unusual. Gardner fasted for the remainder of his time on Earth, reading the David Baldacci crime novel Divine Justice and watching Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings film trilogy. In June of 1988, James Byrd Jr. was brutally attacked by 3 white supremacists in a notorious crime that made national headlines and helped inspire the landmark 2009 federal hate crime bill, the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act. One of the 3 perpetrators, Sean Berry, was sentenced to life in prison for his role in the attack. The other 2, John King and Lawrence Brewer, were both eliminated by the state of Texas, Brewer in 2011 and King in 2019. Brewer's final meal request was extraordinarily elaborate, including 2 chicken fried steaks with gravy and sliced onions, a triple cheeseburger, a cheese omelet with beef, tomatoes, onions, bell peppers, and jalapenos, fried okra with ketchup, a pound of various barbecue meats served with a half loaf of white bread, 3 fully loaded fajitas, a meat lover's pizza, a slab of peanut butter fudge with crushed peanuts on top, a pint of Bluebell vanilla ice cream, and 3 root beers. Once the over-the-top spread arrived, however, Brewer announced he was not hungry and couldn't bear to eat. All the food was thrown away, so in addition to being an especially vicious criminal, Brewer was also a troll. State Senator John Whitmire was so incensed by the discarded feast, he formally requested that the state stop taking final meal requests altogether. The executive director of Texas prisons agreed, permanently ending the practice and making Brewer's never-consumed final meal a truly final meal, in all senses of the word. Today, the Getty family is most closely associated with their massive collections of fine art, especially if you live in Los Angeles, where the Getty Center Museum looms over the west side like a modern Mount Olympus. But before their name became synonymous with the arts, the Gettys were best known as the wealthy family that refused to pay the ransom when one of their own was kidnapped. The story inspired both the recent Ridley Scott film, All the Money in the World, and the FX miniseries, Trust. But those are the Hollywood versions of the story. The real-life ordeal was even more outrageous and tragic. Okay, time to Getty rich or die trying. Before we talk about what happened to J. Paul Getty III, you need to know a little bit about the Getty family, specifically J. Paul Getty I and his son J. Paul Getty Jr., also known as J. Paul Getty Returns. The first Getty, an infamously frugal man, made his vast fortune from oil leases in the 1910s. Even before his grandson's kidnapping made him one of history's most iconic misers, there were already stories about his penny-pinching ways. One long-standing tale indicates that he had installed a payphone in his home in London for guests to use, rather than allow them to make calls on his home line. That's stone cold. I wonder if he had all the refrigerators replaced with vending machines. That's a good idea. Getty's fifth wife, Teddy Getty Gaston, claims that he forced her to pay their young son's medical bills out of her own pocket, even after the boy was diagnosed with a brain tumor. In 1958, the boy, Timmy Getty, passed away at age 12, without his father even attending his funeral. A horrified and grief-stricken Teddy Gaston divorced her husband that same year. Sounds like a good choice, Teddy. Although hopefully she kept the last name. Teddy Getty Gaston. That just works. That could be the name of a successful casual dining chain. But the point is, J. Paul Getty Sr. was an established ogre. He was the kind of miserable bastard they invent new swear words to describe. Getty's son, John Paul Getty Jr., had 4 children of his own with his wife, Gail Harris. After the couple divorced, Jr. relocated to Rome to run the family's Italian business, the cleverly named Getty Oil Italiana. and got remarried to the Dutch actor Talitha Pol. The pair struggled with addiction for years, and Talitha died of an overdose in 1972. Italian police apparently investigated Jr. for his possible involvement in her death, but he was never charged. Which brings us to his son, J. Paul Getty III, or just Paul for short. He was born in 1956, and at age 16 was expelled from private school and moved to Rome to be closer to his father. Once there, he scored some work as an extra on film sets and began selling jewelry and paintings. Paul also got very involved in the club and party scene, as anybody would do if they were rich and 16 and living in Rome in the 70s. I mean, how long can you look at statues? During this period, Paul also started getting more interested in politics and activism. This brings us to the night of July 10th, 1973. Paul was hanging out in Rome's Piazza Navona with a Belgian go-go dancer he'd met recently. Remember, he's here to party and admire antiquity. Suddenly, he was grabbed by members of the Italian mafia, placed into the back of a van, and taken 300 miles south to the city of Calabria. A note was sent to Paul's mother, Gail, reading, "Dear Mother, I have fallen into the hands of kidnappers. Don't let me be killed. Make sure that the police do not interfere." Despite the note's pleas to not attract additional publicity, it was published in Time magazine on July 30th of that year. Kidnappings were somewhat common in Italy at this time, and the young heir to a throne of considerable wealth is just about the most attractive target imaginable for criminals looking to score big on a ransom. But nonetheless, Paul's friends and family were initially skeptical that he was actually being held against his will at all. Apparently, the perpetually broke Paul frequently joked about orchestrating his own kidnapping as a lucrative financial scheme. And look, jokes are fun, but if you happen to be one of the richest teenagers in modern history, you should probably avoid making that particular joke, except on special occasions, or when it's really, really funny. I mean, you gotta go for it. After receiving some scary phone calls from the kidnappers, who threatened to cut off one of Paul's fingers and mail it to his mother, classic kidnappers, the reality of the situation sunk in for all parties involved. The ransom was set at $17 million, which is less money than Arnold Schwarzenegger was paid to play a blue astronaut in a Batman movie.
If I must suffer, humanity will suffer with me.
Nonetheless, Paul's infamously stingy grandfather, J. Paul Getty Sr., refused to pay. He explained that a ready willingness to pay off kidnappers would set a dangerous precedent, telling the media, "If I pay 1 penny now, I'll have 14 kidnapped grandchildren." Getty Sr. may have been a documented ghoul, but his logic is difficult to argue, and is also the standing policy of the United States government: never negotiate with terrorists. And nobody wants to risk 14 kidnapped grandchildren. That is an unreasonable number. However, the downside of this position is that you're letting the kidnappers know they have no reason to keep their hostage alive. Gail, enraged that the Gettys would not pay to save one of their own, attempted to shame her father-in-law in the press, but he would not relent. After all, he did have 13 other grandchildren. Maybe he felt he could afford to lose one. The situation continued like this for several months, until November of 1973, when a Roman newspaper received a package containing a lock of Paul's red hair and a severed ear. There was also a note attached, reading, "This is Paul's ear. If we don't get some money within 10 days, then the other ear will arrive. In other words, he will arrive in little bits." But the kidnappers were willing to play ball. They reduced their ransom demands to $3.2 million, and J. Paul Getty Sr. finally agreed to pay. Sort of. Getty Sr. agreed to pay a portion of the ransom, $2.2 million, and ensured that his portion of the ransom payment was tax deductible. Where do you deduct that? Charitable donations, I guess. Getty Sr. left his son, Getty Jr., on the hook for the rest of the amount. However, Getty Jr. didn't have the cash, so he had to borrow it. It's tough to get a bank loan for ransom. They consider that a risky investment. So Jr. borrowed the money from his father, Getty Sr., at a 4% interest rate. Yeah, J. Paul Getty Sr. charged his son interest on the ransom they paid for his teenage grandson. I mean, he is a shrewd negotiator. Why do you think so many buildings are named after him? After a 5-month ordeal, Paul was finally released by his captors on December 15, 1973, who dropped him by the side of the road during a rainstorm. Paul spent hours trying to flag down a ride in the pouring rain, until he was picked up by a truck driver named Antonio Tedesco. He said to Tedesco, "I am a kidnapping captive. I need to get to a telephone to call my mother in Rome." Also, the kidnappers had not been bluffing. Paul's right ear was, in fact, missing. Paul later told investigators that during his 5 months of captivity, he'd been moved around the region several times. He was kept blindfolded each time to keep him disoriented about his location and prevent him from escaping and finding his way back on his own. Other than the missing ear, some fatigue, and general malnutrition, Paul was physically unharmed, though the incident left him with years of mental and emotional trauma. The money was delivered by a former U.S. intelligence officer named Fletcher Chase. The millions in Italian lira he turned over to the kidnappers had been microfilmed and recorded by police, who also arranged to pass by the area of handoff dressed as tourists to capture photographs of the criminal gang. Once authorities had identified the gang, they followed them covertly, collecting evidence, for a month before making arrests. Wow, you could tail kidnappers for a month? Either they were very good or the kidnappers were very bad. 9 collaborators in total were arrested, but there was only enough hard evidence to ultimately convict 2 of them. For a time, Paul seemed to emerge from his horrifying ordeal with a new lease on life. At age 18, he married a German photographer named Gisela Zacha, and together they had a son. He even enrolled for a semester at Pepperdine University in the United States. Sadly, he was unable to completely escape his demons and fell back into abusing drugs and alcohol after a move to New York City. Original recipe J. Paul Getty died in 1976, leaving nothing to his grandson Paul in his will, and just $500 to Paul's dad, J. Paul Getty Jr. Most of the original Getty fortune went to charities and nonprofit organizations, like that lovely Getty Center in Los Angeles. However, a dozen women also received significant funds from Getty's will, including an ex-wife who received $55,000 a year for life. Additionally, an art dealer, a London widow, and a decorator all got hefty shares of Getty's stock. In 1981, Paul overdosed on a combination of methadone, Valium, and alcohol, and suffered a stroke. The stroke left him completely paralyzed, rendered him unable to speak, and severely impacted his eyesight. Paul and his mother struggled to support themselves in their later lives, and at one point sued his father, J. Paul Getty Jr., for help with medical necessities. Paul died at age 54 in 2011. The film All the Money in the World, relating the story of Paul's kidnapping and his grandfather's unexpected response, was released in December of 2017. The film was based on John Pearson's 1995 book about the case, Painfully Rich: The Outrageous Fortune and Misfortunes of the Heirs of J. Paul Getty. After the film's release, a nephew of one of the kidnappers, a man named Michael Mammoliti, told Variety that everyone had the story wrong, and Paul was actually in on the whole thing from the very start. Mammoliti claimed the kidnapping plot started off with great intentions and only turned into a mess because of the grandpa not wanting to pay. Beyond the questionable credibility of Mammoliti's statements, what exactly were those great intentions? Ripping Grandpa Getty off of $17 million? Actually, that does sound kind of great. It's a shame Grandpa had to screw it all up. On July 10, 1981, Ken Rex McElroy was murdered in Skidmore, Missouri, in one of the most bizarre cases authorities had ever encountered. There were dozens of witnesses to the crime, which occurred in broad daylight. It should have been an easy case to crack, but everyone in the town clammed up, and even today, police still don't know exactly who ended McElroy's life. Okay, time to find out how an entire town banded together to kick Ken Rex McElroy off the planet, like the bad guy at the end of Roadhouse. Ken Rex McElroy was born in 1934 to a family of poor migrant farmers. By the age of 15, he had dropped out of high school and begun to make a name for himself as a top-tier son of a bitch. He was a cattle rustler and small-time thief, and over the years he was suspected of stealing just about everything, including alcohol, gasoline, grain, livestock, and even antiques. You steal my grain? Okay. You steal my antiques? You son of a bitch. Despite the frequent accusations, McElroy was able to avoid convictions with the help of good old-fashioned hoodlum intimidation. More on that in a minute. Speaking of stealing things, McElroy met his future wife, Trenna McLeod, when she was just 12 years old, and he was more than 20 years her senior. McElroy's courtship consisted of routinely following her school bus, honking and yelling at the driver until the bus pulled over and allowed him to abscond with her. Kind of hard to avoid stranger danger when your school bus driver can just be bullied into becoming an accessory to a kidnapping. But that's the kind of hold McElroy had on the people of Skidmore. Trenna gave birth to the pair's first child when she was only 14, at which point, according to court records, she tried to escape him and return home to her parents. But McElroy reportedly found her and took her right back to his house. Yeah, even Trenna's parents were too afraid to stand up to him. Not without reason. McElroy grew angry when Trenna's mother and stepfather refused to permit him to marry their underage daughter. So he allegedly returned to their home, killed their dog, and burned their house to the ground. He was indicted for statutory rape, arson, and assault, and Trenna and the baby were placed in a foster home. This only infuriated McElroy, who was seemingly emboldened by years of never being held accountable for his increasingly heinous deeds. He would sit outside the foster home and threaten to kidnap the family's biological daughter unless they let him take Trenna in what he described as a girl-for-girl exchange. McElroy was nothing if not a fan of blunt force abduction. According to Trenna's accounts, McElroy did finally succeed in marrying her in 1974, which allowed him to avoid any criminal charges for impregnating a minor. Because apparently you can do whatever you want to a child as long as you marry them afterwards? I don't get it. McElroy moved the young girl into the home he shared with his common-law wife, Alice. But even though he was legally married to Trenna, McElroy continued to father children with Alice. All told, the man had 11 children with 3 mothers. And although Trenna would later recant the story that led to McElroy's multiple indictments in an interview with People magazine after his murder, McElroy's predacious nature is a matter of public record. That's the drawback of doing all your crimes out in the open. You collect witnesses like pogs. In another of his numerous criminal interactions with the people of Skidmore, McElroy allegedly shot a farmer named Romaine Henry in 1976. Henry claimed he confronted McElroy for firing guns on his property. Rather than leave, McElroy chose to fire at Henry instead. While waiting for his court date, McElroy repeatedly drove his pickup truck to Henry's farm to try to intimidate him into dropping the charges. But Henry stuck to his guns. Get it? Because of yeah, you get it. Unfortunately, Henry's courage in the face of the town bully didn't amount to much. When a trial was finally set, McElroy managed to find 2 raccoon hunters who claimed he was with them and not on Henry's property on the date in question. In the end, McElroy was acquitted. Throughout his life in Skidmore, McElroy was indicted a staggering 21 times for various offenses, all of which went largely unpunished for one reason or another. In cases where McElroy was arrested and charged, he would employ the same method he used against Henry and Trenna's parents: coercion. As is probably obvious by now, McElroy was scary as hell. So scary that witnesses would typically refuse to testify. Lawyers would balk at prosecuting him, and judges were reluctant to incite his wrath. So the people of Skidmore endured McElroy in his illicit actions without any hope of a conviction sticking. That is, they did, right up until they didn't. The final straw came in 1980 when a store clerk accused McElroy's daughter of taking candy from the Skidmore town grocery, which was owned by 70-year-old Ernest Bo Bowenkamp and his wife Lois. When McElroy was confronted over the matter, his response, and we're totally serious here, was to offer Lois Bowenkamp money to fight his wife, Trenna. Apparently, he was looking to kickstart a lucrative series of wife fight videos. The 80s. Lois did not go for it, and McElroy, a man with a documented history of holding grudges, began stalking the Bowenkamps outside of their store in his pickup truck with his gun in hand. The situation escalated until July of that year, when McElroy cornered Bowenkamp on the store's loading dock. 2 young boys were watching, so McElroy gave them some money to go buy soda, eliminating any witnesses. Once the boys had cleared out, McElroy shot Bowenkamp in the neck. McElroy was arrested and charged with attempted murder. However, even though the case successfully went to trial, he was only convicted of the lesser crime of assault, and he was quickly released on bail pending appeal. As it would turn out, McElroy would have been better off staying in jail. This latest example of judicial wrangling made it seem like McElroy was going to find a way to escape punishment once again. But the people of Skidmore had had enough. A hearing to revoke McElroy's bond was scheduled for the morning of July 10, 1981, and the townsfolk decided to combine their efforts to protect the witnesses who were set to testify. McElroy, however, was able to get the hearing postponed, which was good for him, but infuriating to the town. Soon after being released, McElroy made an appearance at a local bar called the D&G Tavern, where he brandished a rifle and made explicit threats against Bowenkamp, describing what he planned to do in, shall we say, legally actionable detail. Several people who overheard him wondered if there was anything they could do to prevent McElroy from hurting people, and a local sheriff suggested they form a neighborhood watch. That's some mighty fine police work, Sheriff. Although, in fairness, it was obvious at this point that the legal system wasn't going to do anything about McElroy. A town meeting was held to discuss McElroy, although outside of the people who attended, no one knows for certain exactly what was discussed. It could have been a meeting to iron out the details of a community watch program, but it's also entirely plausible that the attendees were planning McElroy's murder. And honestly, it could have been both. Okay, everyone, the neighborhood watch has been formed. Let's see, item 1 on the agenda. Oh, shooting Ken Rex McElroy. On the day of McElroy's murder, he had returned to the D&G Tavern with Trenna. At the same time, the townsfolk were meeting about McElroy at the local Legion Hall. When they heard he was back at the bar, they all headed over and packed the place out. Perhaps sensing something was about to go down, McElroy hurriedly finished his drinks, bought a six-pack, and headed back to his car. He climbed in his pickup truck with Trenna, parked on the main street of Skidmore, in broad daylight, when he was suddenly surrounded by a disgruntled group of over 30 town residents. As McElroy nonchalantly reached to light a cigarette, several shots were fired into the truck. Bullets struck him in the head and neck while Trenna screamed in horror. No one attempted to assist McElroy, and no one called an ambulance. Ken Rex McElroy died at the scene. Police knew there had to have been more than one shooter. One shot had come from behind the truck and another from a block away. Additionally, shell casings from 2 different guns were found at the scene: a .22 caliber Magnum and an 8mm Mauser. Having multiple shooters at the scene of the crime may have been part of a deliberate effort to heighten confusion, making it difficult for authorities to pinpoint who was responsible. Or, considering McElroy's decades-long track record of being a wanton bastard, it may have just been a case of more than one person wanting to take a shot at him. With so many witnesses to the crime and at least 2 people pulling the trigger, County Prosecutor David Baird convened a grand jury, confident a suspect would be identified and detained. However, no suspect was ever named, and no arrests were ever made. The FBI even got involved and conducted over 100 interviews, but was unable to produce a single shred of evidence to tie anyone to McElroy's killing. The people of Skidmore simply refused to talk, so no indictments could be issued. McElroy's wife, Trenna, eventually accused a rancher and business owner named Del Clement for firing one of the fatal shots. But Clement never confessed, and the police never charged him with anything. A coroner's jury conducted an investigation, but ultimately they couldn't produce enough evidence tying Clement to the crime for an arrest warrant, and no one would corroborate Trenna's accusation. In 1984, Trenna filed a wrongful death suit against the county sheriff's office, the mayor, and Del Clement. Although she was seeking $6 million, the suit was settled out of court for just over $17,000, and no wrongdoing was ever admitted by any of the parties involved. In 1988, award-winning true crime author Harry N. McLean wrote a New York Times bestseller about the whole ordeal titled In Broad Daylight. The book chronicles McElroy's life, beginning as the 15th of 16 children, dropping out of school at age 15, and embarking on a life of crime that ended in a mysterious case of vigilante justice. In 1999, a film adaptation of the book was produced for television, starring Brian Dennehy as Len Rowan, a character very clearly based on McElroy. Meanwhile, Trenna, arguably the biggest victim of both McElroy and the town of Skidmore, eventually remarried, left Skidmore, and moved to Lebanon, Missouri, where she passed away in January of 2012 on her 55th birthday. Every now and then, nature likes to remind us humans that we're not the center of the universe, and that at any moment, any one of us could find ourselves in the belly of a big fish. That's exactly what happened in 1935, when a 14-foot tiger shark regurgitated a human arm at an Australian aquarium, prompting a police investigation that uncovered a mystery so wild, it remains unsolved to this day. Okay, time to take a bite out of crime. Visitors attending the Coogee Aquarium Baths on April 25, 1935, were expecting to enjoy a fun afternoon of admiring exotic marine life. While they technically still got a unique experience, it probably wasn't exactly what anyone had in mind. A 14-foot tiger shark had gotten itself tangled in a local fisherman's line, so the fisherman brought the animal to the aquarium for show. I guess throwing it back was out of the question. Once at the aquarium, the shark apparently became stricken with extreme performance anxiety and spat up the contents of its stomach, which included a bird, a rat, and a mangled human arm. Technically, it was a Russian doll situation. The 14-foot shark had actually swallowed a smaller shark, and that shark had gulped down the severed limb. Chaos ensued, and investigators were called to the scene to try and sort out what had happened. Generally, when you find a human arm in the belly of a shark, the obvious conclusion is that the rest of the person is probably in the shark as well. Fatal shark attacks are rare, but they do occur. And a 14-foot tiger shark was certainly big enough to eat a guy. At first, it seemed likely that whoever the unlucky owner of the regurgitated arm was, they had either been attacked and killed by the shark or had drowned, and the shark had merely taken a bite out of their waterlogged remains. But when a coroner and a shark expert were called in to examine the evidence, they concluded that the shark had not bitten off the severed limb. In fact, there were no tooth marks on the arm at all. Instead, they determined that a blade had been used to separate the limb. This was a troubling discovery, because it meant that officials weren't dealing with an accident or an animal attack, unless sharks figured out how to use knives, which would still be troubling. New South Wales authorities had a homicide on their hands, and one with no obvious answers. If the shark had not attacked the victim, how had it come to swallow the victim's arm? Did the murderer dismember the victim and throw the body into the water piece by piece? Or did the murderer feed the remains to the shark directly? And most importantly, who did the arm belong to? The case opened up as detectives further examined the arm for clues. Collecting evidence from a swallowed body part would be difficult in any decade. But in the 1930s, forensic science was much less advanced, making the task that much harder. When the homicide investigation was launched, the arm was examined for unusual marks or scars. Of particular note was a rope tied around the wrist. Unless the arm had been severed in a freak rope swinging accident, the rope told police that foul play had likely occurred. Even more vital than the rope was a tattoo of two boxers in sparring position. That's a pretty uncommon tattoo. So investigators had photos and a description of the body art published in a local newspaper, hoping that someone would recognize the unique image and come forward to identify the victim. Luckily, a man named Edwin Smith recognized the tattoo, and the arm it belonged to, that of his brother, 40-year-old James Jimmy Smith, a boxer who had recently gone missing. That's a heck of a way to find out why your brother hasn't been answering the phone. While Edwin received some closure on his brother's disappearance, his identification of the arm only led the police to more questions, notably, how did Jimmy Smith's arm end up in a shark? And where was the rest of Jimmy Smith? The police used the information Edwin provided to trace James Smith's last movements and try to find a suspect. And they found one in short order, a friend of Smith's who was up to no good. When James Smith's final movements were tracked, the police found that he'd been playing dominoes with a man named Patrick Brady at a local seaside hotel bar. As it turned out, Brady had a few prior convictions and was known to be a little shady. Further investigation uncovered the fact that Brady had vacated his apartment right after Smith had gone missing. Things looked even worse for Brady when they got to his apartment. It had been deeply cleaned, furniture and bedding had been replaced, and Brady had purchased a brand new trunk. There was even a rowboat there, and it had been cleaned from top to bottom. Well, I'm no big city detective, but that all sounds pretty suspicious. The police agreed, thinking it strange that a small-time crook would suddenly deep clean his apartment and rowboat right around the time his friend's remains got spat up by a fish. Brady became the prime suspect in the investigation, but beyond the circumstantial evidence, there wasn't anything to tie him to the crime yet, not even a motive. Additionally, the case experienced a heartbreaking setback just 3 days after the severed arm was discovered. The Coogee Aquarium in New South Wales terminated the tiger shark. This dealt a blow to the investigation. It could no longer be examined for any other potential evidence. It was also a missed opportunity for the aquarium. People would have paid double to see a man-eater. With Patrick Brady as a suspect, the police at least had a promising lead, if not the evidence to make an arrest. But then a taxi driver came forward and shook things up even more. The cab driver admitted to having driven Brady to the home of a man named Reggie Lloyd Holmes the day after James Smith was last seen. Holmes was an established shipbuilder and businessman, but according to the witness, Holmes was bad news. He used his boats in drug smuggling rings and insurance scams. Furthermore, both Smith and Brady had worked with Holmes on his schemes, despite the fact that Holmes initially claimed he didn't know either of them. That's a red flag. A bite-sized one. The police suspected that the three had been working together on some kind of illegal activity and something had gone horribly wrong, but couldn't extract any information out of the men. Holmes refused to talk and was released from questioning. The police charged Brady, their initial prime suspect, in connection to Smith's apparent demise. But the case was about to take another unexpected turn. After the cops released Holmes from questioning, he took his speedboat out on the water and shot himself, letting his body fall overboard. Fortunately, Holmes hadn't been terribly precise. The bullet that was supposed to have ended his life had merely wounded him, and he climbed back into the boat, largely unscathed. People out on the water who had witnessed this bizarre incident called the police. When they arrived, Holmes led them on a Keystone Cops boat chase around the harbor and into the ocean until he finally decided to throw in the towel. Holmes was brought back in for questioning, and this time, he told the police the whole story of what happened to James Smith. According to Holmes, Patrick Brady had whacked James Smith, dumping most of him into the ocean in a trunk. So that's why he needed a new trunk. But Brady had kept Smith's arm and brought it to Holmes's house to threaten him. According to Holmes, Brady blackmailed him by threatening to do the same to him if he didn't pay for Brady's silence. Holmes maintained that when Brady left, he tied a weight to the arm with a piece of rope and threw it into the ocean, which he presumed was when the shark entered the picture. The shark actually corroborated Brady's version of events, as Smith's arm had indeed been the only human body part discovered in its stomach. Holmes agreed to give his version of events in court, but the day before the trial, he was found dead in his car. Considering the previous botched attempt and subsequent boat chase, it certainly seemed like Holmes had offed himself. But the timing of his death was suspicious. The police weren't sure if he had taken his own life or if Brady had done him in to keep him from testifying. There was also a theory that Holmes had hired a hitman to take himself out so that his family could still collect on his life insurance policy. Holmes had withdrawn £500 from the bank the day before his body was discovered, so the hitman theory, while a little outlandish, wasn't unbelievable. Either way, this was a big problem. Without Holmes's testimony, there wasn't enough evidence to convict Brady. Without Holmes's testimony, police couldn't even prove that Smith was dead. For all they knew, he could be stumbling around Sydney, missing one arm, but otherwise alive and well. So with no new developments and the only evidence being one severed arm and a deceased shark, the case fell apart. In September of 1935, Brady was acquitted of all charges, but was immediately arrested on an unrelated charge of forgery. Hey, the guy was a criminal. He wasn't going to suddenly change careers because of some loose-lipped shark. However, Brady continued to maintain his innocence in this particular crime for the next 30 years, until his passing in 1965. Legal historian Alex Castles remained unconvinced that Patrick Brady was capable of taking James Smith's life. He also didn't see a clear motive for Brady going after Smith in the first place, since they were friends. And Holmes's version of events does seem a little too conveniently self-absolving, although he was clearly shaken up by what had occurred. In his 1995 book, The Shark Arm Murders, great title, Castle suggests that Smith was actually a police informant who got snuffed out by a criminal named Eddie Wyman. Castles alleges that Smith told the police critical information that led to Wyman's arrest. So Wyman took revenge on Smith and silenced him for good. But Castle's theory is just that, a theory. Officially, the shark arm case has never been solved. And after 90 years, it seems unlikely that it ever will. On August 20th, 1989, Jose and Kitty Menendez were brutally slain in their home by their sons, Lyle and Eric. The story was dramatized in Netflix's Monsters, the Lyle and Eric Menendez story. And like any Hollywood adaptation, some of the details are true, while others are pure fiction. Okay, time to see how much of this true crime story is really true. As portrayed in the series, when authorities first arrived at the scene of the crime, just hours after the Menendez brothers killed their parents, Lyle and Eric appeared genuinely distraught. In fact, the brothers were so convincing, investigators didn't even bother to test their hands for gunshot residue. Instead, police initially believed the murders were committed by the Mafia, or another organized crime entity connected with the Menendez's company. Live Entertainment Incorporated of Van Nuys, a video and music distributor. Early news reports also called the crime a gangland-style killing, based on the fact both Kitty and Jose suffered from gunshots to the kneecaps, along with several other fatal gunshot wounds. The LA Times, for example, confidently cited a source that blamed two hitmen, saying, "It was definitely a message. There's no question it's organized crime." Just another good reminder not to believe everything you read in the papers. In Monsters, Eric and Lyle arrive at their parents' funeral an hour late. Lyle then stands up before the 400 grieving attendees to deliver the final eulogy. During his speech, he plays "Girl, I'm Gonna Miss You," a 1989 single by dance pop group Milli Vanilli, explaining that the song's lyrics more accurately describe his feelings than he can put into words himself. The scene is so over the top, particularly Lyle's choice of Milli Vanilli, a band famously known for lying, that it had to have been invented by a screenwriter, but proving once again that truth is often stranger than fiction. That whole scene happened in real life pretty much exactly as it plays out in the show. As depicted in the series, 20-year-old Lyle did, in fact, wear a toupee at his father's insistence. Jose encouraged his son to purchase the hairpiece before entering Princeton, where we presume balding students just weren't taken seriously. And as depicted in the series, during a fight with Lyle, his mother Kitty ripped off his toupee, which was held on by a strong adhesive. It sounds funny, but it really happened, and it actually caused Lyle immense pain. Afterwards, Eric ran to comfort his brother, and the two discussed the abuse they had endured throughout their childhoods. And that part is all true. But on the show, the brothers hatched their violent plan then and there. While the facts indicate at this point Lyle just invited Eric to move to Princeton with him as a way to escape their parents. In the first episode of Monsters, Eric's therapist calls Lyle to his office where, much to Lyle's chagrin, he confesses his crimes to the doctor. And just as the show suggests, the real-life Eric did initially seek help from Dr. Jerome Oziel because he was overwhelmed with guilt. Oziel then recorded their session of December 11, 1989, during which the siblings confessed to the crime on tape. According to the brothers' confession, their mother Kitty had been depressed due to their father's extramarital affairs, and they hoped to put her out of her misery. They also stated their belief that their father deserved to die because of the suffering he caused their mother. During the second episode, Lyle chastises Eric for writing a play about killing their parents. Although, in his defense, they do say write what you know. That's actually true. 5 years before Ross, Rachel, Chandler, Monica, Joey, and Phoebe would arrive on TV, Eric penned a script that was suspiciously similar to the crime he eventually committed, and named it Friends. The younger Menendez brother described the lead character, Hamilton Cromwell, as immensely psychotic and extremely anxious to obtain his inheritance, a character worthy of Jekyll and Hyde. To secure those funds, Hamilton offs his parents as they lie in their bed. According to Eric's friend and co-writer, Craig Signorelli, the protagonist wanted to gain an inheritance so he could fulfill his dreams of creating a hunting ground for humans. Signorelli would later admit an eerie resemblance between the script's opening scene and what happened on the night of the murders. Eric asked another friend, photographer Philip Kearney, to review the screenplay and share his opinion on the narrative. While Kearney wasn't initially interested in reading the script, he revisited it upon learning that the Menendez brothers were responsible for their parents' slayings, later recalling, "I had looked at enough of the screenplay to know that it was basically the same thing that occurred." The later episodes of the series focus on the brothers opening up about the alleged abuse they suffered at the hands of their parents, and claiming that abuse is what ultimately drove them to commit the crime. In real life, Lyle and Eric did both testify that their father molested them as children, and claimed the murders were a direct result of the emotional scars they suffered in an abusive household. But the show leaves out some considerable evidence that seems to support the brothers' allegations. For instance, nude photos of Lyle and Eric as children were discovered in an envelope with Kitty's handwriting on it, and Eric had written a letter about the alleged abuse to his cousin in December of 1988, 8 months before the crime. More recently, in the 2023 docuseries Menendez and Menudo, Boys Betrayed, former Menudo member Roy Rossello claimed that Jose Menendez drugged and sexually abused him while Menendez was head of RCA Records. However, while Lyle did testify that he had contributed to some of Eric's abuse, there's no evidence to suggest the brothers had an incestuous relationship, as the show theorizes, and both brothers firmly deny it. Eric and Lyle Menendez both alleged that their parents sexually abused them during their initial trials. While the defense teams each presented their cases, prosecutors argued that the brothers were after financial gains when they killed their parents. Lyle's prosecutor, Pam Bosanich, claimed that it was impossible for men to be sexually assaulted because they lack the necessary equipment. Los Angeles County District Attorney Gil Garcetti retried the Menendez brothers, as depicted on the show. But in the real-life trial, the judge limited the amount of testimony given about sexual abuse allegations. It was only in the penalty phase, after Lyle and Eric had already been convicted, that testimony about their alleged abuse was allowed. Before that, the prosecution successfully argued that any testimony about the topic was irrelevant. They told the jury that the Menendez brothers were lying, simply using the abuse excuse to get away with murder. Episode 3 of Monsters depicts the brothers struggling to adapt to life behind bars after growing up in luxury, prompting Lyle to devise an extensive, albeit delusional, escape plan. The plan, which is quickly discovered and confiscated from Eric's cell, includes acquiring a getaway sports car, changing their names, undergoing plastic surgery, and then fleeing to Canada. In real life, correctional officers found the escape plan in Lyle's cell, not Eric's. But the rest is true. Lyle really did draw up extensive notes on various ideas about a potential escape, which were introduced as evidence in their eventual retrial. And the notes did include phrases like change name, change appearance, plastic surgeon, as well as how transfer money, how communicate overseas. In Monsters, Eric's therapist, Dr. L. Jerome Oziel, kept recordings of his conversations with Eric and Lyle, some of which were later used in their initial trials after Oziel's mistress told police about them. That's all true, and Oziel ultimately lost his license to practice in 1997 for violating patient confidentiality. But the show leaves out that Oziel was already on probation at the time of the brothers' first trial for exchanging therapy for construction work on his house. Meanwhile, Dr. William Vickery, who was appointed by attorney Leslie Abramson to evaluate and treat Eric, testified that he believed his patient was truthful. It later came to light that Vickery altered his notes to remove potentially damaging information, and he was placed on probation, ultimately surrendering his medical license in 2019 after receiving another suspension in an unrelated case. According to the show, the brothers had previously been accused of burglary, and in episode 6, Jose drives Lyle and Eric around town, forcing them to apologize to the victims before writing them checks to cover the costs of the stolen goods. In reality, both brothers were allegedly involved in home burglary incidents with damages amounting to around $100,000 prior to the murders. Eric alone was charged with the crimes, but to keep his youngest son from a more severe penalty, Jose returned most of the stolen goods and wrote a check for $11,000 to cover any missing items. Lyle was never arrested in connection with the burglaries, but he was eventually tied to one committed at the New Jersey office of the Sierra Club and the Princeton Friends of Open Spaces, properties Jose Menendez owned prior to moving to California. O.J. Simpson never actually appears on screen in the series, but Eric is depicted giving him advice through their adjacent prison cells. As contrived as it seems that they would be jail neighbors, it actually happened. After being arrested in connection with the murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman, Simpson was, in fact, placed in a cell next to Eric's. Eric advised Simpson to avoid talking to prison guards and other cellmates regarding the case. Lyle also frequently interacted with Simpson, encouraging him to plead guilty and share the truth surrounding the murders with jurors. While the show mostly got this right, they did change a few minor details. For example, the relevant episode depicts Eric warning Simpson about using Robert Shapiro as a defense attorney. In reality, it was actually Lyle who penned a letter sharing his concern over the decision. O.J. was probably glad he didn't take that particular piece of advice. In the series, Lyle and Eric are initially tried together, with the jurors unable to reach a decision. In reality, they were both tried separately, albeit concurrently. But both of their trials ended with a hung jury. 2 years later, however, they were retried together as depicted in the show. And in the final episode of Monsters, one juror is so convinced the brothers deserve the death penalty, she has a heart attack pleading her case to her fellow jurors. She's then replaced by another juror with more compassion for the brothers, who convinces the other 11 to give them life in prison instead. That's all true, for the most part. Juror Bruce Seitz did really replace another juror who had a heart attack during the deliberations. In reality, however, this happened during the verdict stage of the trial, rather than during the sentencing phase, as depicted on the show. And while the show ends with Lyle and Eric being driven away to separate prisons, never to see each other again, in reality, the brothers were transferred to the same facility in 2018, where they are able to eat meals and spend rec time together. No further escape plans have been discovered. So what do you think? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our weird history.